today's second lecture of this course, Coherence and Quantum Entanglement. So today we are going to discuss introduction to coherence and stochastic processes. So before we begin, let's have a quick look at what we did in lecture number 1. So in lecture number 1, the first thing, we looked at in detail as to what are the differences between classical and quantum mechanics, and within that we looked at the superposition principle and interference within classical and quantum mechanics and the differences in detail. So the superposition in classical wave theory, that involves division of amplitude. This division of amplitude invariably involves division of energy, and the interference is because of the superposition of those amplitudes. This theory is fundamentally incorrect, but definitely it works at high light level, but it doesn't work at the level of single photons. So then we need quantum theory. The quantum theory, the main difference is that here we don't have division of amplitude because we don't have real fields. We have wave function, and superposition involves a division of wave function, and this division of wave function does not involve division of energy. And of course the interference is because of the superposition of wave functions. Now quantum theory is fundamentally correct, but we need mostly this theory at the level of single photons. At high light level, it turns out that the classical theory, the classical calculations in most cases yield the correct experimental results, so we do use classical theory at high light level, but at single photon levels we can only use quantum theory. So this we need to keep in mind that this theory is fundamentally incorrect, but definitely works at high light level. But this theory is fundamentally correct, works at any light level, but we mostly use it at the level of single photons. This entire thing of superposition and coherence and how it actually behaves within quantum theory can very nicely be summarized by what Dirac said, and he says a photon interferes with itself. This is the best explanation one can have, although it doesn't make sense, but this is the best explanation that we have so far, that a photon interferes with itself. Interference between two different photons never occur. In fact, when we go to the two-particle quantum mechanics, there I will also try to kind of have a very analogous kind of intuition that they will say that a two-photon, we'll try to explain all the interference effect with the intuition that a two-photon interferes with itself. So this is actually a very important statement made by Dirac, and that's how we explain all the interferences within quantum mechanics. The other thing we saw, that was Bohr's complementarity principle, and that says that any effort to get the Witch slit information, or in other words the particle information, it actually destroys the interference pattern or the wave information. And to the extent that we get this information, the same degree, to the same extent the other information actually gets destroyed, and that's Bohr's complementarity principle. So just quickly, this is how we understand classical interference. So this is classical source, this is slit, double slit, and that's my interference recording screen. I have just put it at different time shots. So if the light is very low intensity, then we see interference pattern, pretty faint interference pattern. If the light intensity increases, slightly bright interference pattern. If the light intensity increases further, even brighter interference pattern. So qualitatively, there is no difference between the interference patterns with different light intensities, or just the different time integration. It remains the same. On the other hand, in quantum mechanics, this is qualitatively different. So if we have the same experiment with single photons, if we collect the photons on the screen for only a few, very small amount of time, then what we get is just the dotted structure. Collected for a little longer, we get more dots. Connected for enough time, and then we actually have the same pattern that we actually have in the classical case. So the point is, if we dim the source, if we keep doing it, keep reducing the intensity of the source, classically the interference pattern doesn't change. The qualitative behavior in the interference pattern remains the same. It's just that the overall intensity, the overall energy of the interference pattern, that just decreases. On the other hand, in quantum mechanics, if you look at the interference pattern at very high light level photon levels, then we do see a continuous kind of pattern. But when we decrease it, this continuous pattern actually goes away, and then all we end up with is this dotted structure. So that actually is the difference between classical and quantum interferences. Okay, so with that, let's get to today's lecture, and today we are going to introduce coherence. So there's just a very few basic statements and basic intuition about coherence that I'm going to present, and then we'll later we'll do all this in with much more mathematical rigor. So when fields, this is a generic understanding we have of coherence, that when fields coming from two different space-time points are perfectly coherent, the interference that results has to be perfect. On the other hand, if the interference is not perfect, then that means that the fields at the two space-time points that we're talking about are only partially coherent. So just to kind of explain that, let's say this is the light field coming from some source. There is a Young's double slit here. There's two slits. Of course, light from these two slits are then going to go forward, and here we have a screen, and now we look at what is the intensity pattern that gets formed at this screen. Of course, we know that there should be an interference pattern as a function of this x, and if we see that this interference pattern is almost 100% visibility, very nice visibility, we say that this is highly coherent. That means the light the interference visibility at this point that we see on the screen is basically representative of how much is this light at this point x1 is coherent with the light at this point x2. Okay, so the interference here tells us about the degree of coherence of light between x1 and x2 at this point. So this interference pattern tells us that the light coming from x1 and x2 are highly coherent. But suppose if instead of this, if we see that the interference pattern is like this, of course the total energy is still the same, but the lower points are not going all the way down to 0, and the higher points again, the maxima are not going as high. So then in this case we say that the light coming from these two slits are mutually partially coherent. If we see that this variation is even smaller, I mean this case is very small, and this is like almost incoherent, near to incoherent light. So that is the kind of intuitive understanding we have of coherence, that if the light coming from two different space-time points are coherent, they have to produce pretty good visibility interference pattern. If the interference pattern doesn't have as nice a visibility, that means it is not coherent. Of course, it is almost impossible to get perfectly incoherent light, and similarly it is almost impossible to get perfectly coherent light. It's always in between that we have. Okay, so some more points about coherence. Now, as to when we have partial coherence, when we don't have perfect coherence, what is the cause for that? So the cause for that is that the field produced by real sources are more or less random. And why is that? That's because a real physical source consists of infinitely many emitters, all of which emit in a statistically independent manner. So for example, if this is a source, an emitter, it consists of a lot of, let's say, atoms or molecules that emit light. But and all these emitters, if this is atom or molecule, they are emitting independently. When this atom emits versus when this atom emits, there is no correlation either in time or in the phases of the field that these atoms produce. So there's simply no correlation between the fields produced by these different atoms. And as a result, if we look at the complete total field that is produced by the source, all these atoms together, and here we are talking about the Avogadro number of atom in any realistic source. And again, if all of them are emitting on their own and independently, then of course the field at this point x1 and x2, they will be partially coherent only, they cannot be fully coherent. Okay, so that's the kind of intuitive understanding as to why do we even have partial coherence. Now, just bringing both classical and quantum theory and descriptions, what we have is that coherence as a requirement for interference actually remains the same in both classical and quantum descriptions. That we'll see in detail, but here I'm just kind of putting everything together. Within quantum theory, the concept of coherence can also be cast in terms of indistinguishability arguments. This I had this we had discussed in the last lecture as well, but I just put it all together. So what this means is that if a photon in two interfering alternatives remain indistinguishable, then two alternatives become mutually coherent, and as a result, interference takes place. So this is the example that we had seen last time. That is a laser, single photons are coming one by one, and we saw that if there was no polarizer, if this was a polarizer kept at 45-degree angle, if there is no polarizer, then we have that the photon coming from this side is vertical, photon coming from this side is horizontal. So if we just look at the photon here and put a polarizer, then if you find that it is H, then we know for sure that it came this way. If we find that it is V, then we know for sure that it came this way, and hence in that case there is no interference pattern. But if we do put a polarizer at 45-degree, then whatever photon gets through it has to be 45-degree polarized. And of course, a horizontally polarized light has 50% chance of passing through a polarizer at 45-degree, as well as a vertically polarized photon also has 50% chance of passing through a polarizer kept at 45-degree. So if we look at the photon here and then find that it is 45-degree polarized, then of course we have no way of knowing whether it came this way or that way. And since in this case we do not have we have lost the ability of finding out whether the photon came this way or that way, that means we have lost the ability to find the which path information, then since that information is lost, now the interference will actually appear. So that is the indistinguishability argument by which one explains interference within quantum mechanics. That is also one way of kind of doing it. Okay, some more broader perspective of coherence. So coherence in general is when we study coherence, we actually try to quantify the degree of order in a random field. So of course this is all the atoms are emitting randomly. So is it completely incoherent? No, there is some coherence still there, and in fact we find that as we move out from the source, the spatial coherence will actually also increase. So the coherence theory is actually what it does basically quantifies the degree of coherence in a random field. Now within classical description, randomness is in principle removable if complete information about the system becomes available. This is easier said than done, but in principle a randomness is actually removable within classical theory. But of course, since it is very difficult, one studies randomness through correlation functions only, even within classical description. On the other hand, in quantum description, the randomness is not removable even in principle. And here the only concrete quantity that can be studied is the correlation function. As I said, within classical theory it is in principle removable, but in quantum mechanics it is even in principle one cannot remove. But when it comes to random fields, even within classical description, we study correlation. We study it through correlation functions only, and same is true in quantum description as well. There can be some class of fields for which the classical and quantum description of coherence yield the same result, but of course this is not true in general. And one example that we can have here is of course the entangled field. With entangled fields, the experimental results that we see can definitely never be explained in terms of classical theories. But there definitely can be few fields, certain fields that actually can be explained either using classical coherence theory or quantum coherence theory. Okay. So this was just the basic conceptual description of what coherence is and what coherence theory aims to kind of achieve and do. And now I'm actually going to go through some essential concepts of stochastic processes that we're going to use when we study these the second order coherence in detail. So and I think most of the concept must be familiar with the people taking this course. So the first concept I want to look at is the basics of probability theory. So what we have here is that in this example we have somebody just throwing a ball into this box, and one wants to find out where actually the box ends up in the where the ball ends up in the box. Of course, it has to be between A and B because that's a hard block, so it can't go beyond that. So, but between A and B, it can actually go anywhere. And suppose this is the probability density of this event happening. Then let's say Px is the probability density that the ball after landing in the box is found at position x. Then we know that the Px dx, that dx is the tiny x interval, Px dx is the probability that the position of the ball is between x and x plus dx. The probability that the ball is found between A and B has to be unity because these are the hard blocks and the ball cannot go beyond that. So the probability Px dx integrated from A to B has to be 1, which basically says that the ball has to be found between A and B. And for any other pair of points, let's say A naught and B naught, the probability that the ball is found between those pair of points is basically Px dx integrated between A0 and B0. So that's the basics of probability. Now here let me just make the comment that within classical theory, I mean, although this is a random event, but within classical theory, if we knew everything about this ball, if we knew everything about this hand and temperature and humidity and everything, then in principle it is possible to predict where exactly the ball is going to land. However, of course, practically it is not possible. It is just not possible to have that much of information. But in principle, if we have that much of information, one can actually predict as to where the ball will land within the box. But in a quantum setup, in a quantum system, that is not possible, and that's what we mean when we say that the randomness within quantum mechanics is even in principle not removable. Okay, now the other concept that is very useful and is actually at the core is the concept of ensemble average. Since it's a random process, we cannot find out what happens with the process. So all that we can find out is through what's called the ensemble average. Now, what is the concept of ensemble? So for a random variable, let's say x, the collection of its all possible realizations constitute the ensemble of x. So for example, in this somebody throwing the ball in the box example, let's say in the first experiment, the person throws the ball and the ball lands up somewhere here, that's called x is 1. You do the experiment, but this experiment done in exactly the same set of environment. Nothing is changed here. But if you throw the ball, since it's a random event, the ball will land somewhere in the box. Maybe not, definitely not at the same location. We keep repeating the experiment infinite number of times, and each time the ball lands somewhere. So these are called the realizations of the random event. This event was done within the exactly same circumstances, the conditions, but of course the ball lands at different locations because it's random. So these different realizations, they are called these different realizations, these constitute the ensemble for that random variable. Of course, they need not be separated in time. When we talk about ensemble, we actually mean all these realizations to be the simultaneous realization. But of course, in practice, we cannot realize all these realizations at the same time simultaneously. So mostly, we will see that the concept of ensemble average becomes useful when we it becomes actually really useful in the context of when we do time average, space average, angle average, and so on. But this is the concept of ensemble. These are the all the different realizations of the same event, and these are supposed to kind of exist simultaneously. Okay. Of course, for a random process, individual realizations do not yield meaningful information. So the most relevant quantity, the relevant quantity is the ensemble average, and it is actually the average of a random variable one obtains if the same experiment is repeated over a large number of times. So how do we define the ensemble average? This actually is done as part of any basic probability. Let me just yeah. So how do we define the ensemble? So here we see that we have all these different realizations, and in each realization the value of x is, let's say, x1, x2, and xi in the ith realization. So the ensemble average is defined as write it as this is the ensemble, this angular bracket that represent ensemble average, and this is defined in the following manner. This is, of course, limit and going to infinity. N is for the normalization. So this is the ith realization, and that's that's one of these. And we take this ith realization and then sum them over and divide them by the number of realization. Of course, when we say ensemble average, we do mean it in the context of n being infinity. Okay, so of course, this x is the ith realization in the ensemble, and we typically define this in the limit n going to infinity. Okay, so this is the definition, and most of the time we don't actually use it because, of course, it's not practical to have these many realizations, and quite often we have the probability density. Even though we don't have this individual realization, we do have the probability density. And so when we do have the probability density of a random process, then the ensemble average can also be calculated in this manner. This is a different way of doing the same thing. So it's this time it's called the expectation value. We can write it the same manner, that is the angular brackets. And this we define as, so this is the random event x, the probability density is px. So then we integrate this from whatever is the range of integration. Here it is from a to b, so we integrate this, and that gives us the expectation value. This is called the expectation value. So when the probability density is known, then we can also calculate the expectation value, and the expectation value is same as the ensemble average. There is no difference. And in fact, in this course, the concept of ensemble average and the expectation value, we will use them interchangeably in this course. So it basically depends on whether the probability density of a random process is given or not. One uses one or the other definition. Okay. So now the expectation value or the ensemble average of x is not the only quantity that we can find about the random process. There can be whole hierarchy of expectation values yielding different levels of information about a random process. So for example, here it's x, and then we looked at the expectation value of x, but there can be other expectation values. And for example, what is defined is what's called the rth order moment of a random process. The rth order moment of a random process is defined in this manner. Let me just use a different color, blue, it is better. So we have just now defined the expectation value of x, but let's just do x r. So now this is the expectation value of x to the r, and that's called the rth order moment of a random process. And this is defined, you can guess how is this. The definition of expectation value remains the same. So this is just x r dx dx. This is r. So this is xr. So this is the rth order moment, and this yields a lot of other information that the expectation value of x does not, and this we will see throughout this course. Of course, the first moment, the x, that is called the mean. In fact, it is also a practice actually quite useful to define the higher order moments, this rth order moment and so on, around the mean. And in that case, these are called the central moments. So the rth central order moment we can define as is the same definition, almost the same definition. It's just that we have to define it around mean. So that means we just subtract it from the mean. So if x minus mean of x, so that becomes the quantity. And if you want the rth order moment of this one, so this quantity times rth and the expectation value of this. So of course this is defined in a very analogous manner. The definition remains the same. So now it's like x minus mean x raised to the r dx dx. Okay, so this is the definition of the central moment. This is the definition of the central moment. And of course, the first central moment is always 0 because we are subtracting the mean. So of course, the first moment has to be 0. The second central moment is actually called the variance. This we are all familiar with. And the square root of this variance is called the standard deviation. So that's under root x minus mean x, that's whole square. That's the second central moment, and that is the square root of that is the standard deviation. As it is the variance. Also, one fact without proving it, if the probability density is a Gaussian function, if Px is a Gaussian function, then it turns out all the higher order moments can be expressed in terms of the first two central moments. However, this is of course not the case for a general probability density, but this is a very special property of the Gaussian function. So this we just keep in mind. Now, the moment of a process is not the only the moments of a process is not the only useful information one can extract from the random process. We can actually have, in many physical situations, we can actually have more than one random variables. And in that case, one uses joint probability, because one might be interested as to what is the joint probability of this event and that event happening together. So joint probability is the probability that the two events happen together. So let's take an example that let's say x1 and x2 be two random variables, and px1 x2 be the joint probability density. Of course, how we find it, that depends on the details of the experiment and situation, but let's say x1 x2 are two random variables and px1 x2 is the joint probability density. That means this is the probability density that both the events happen together. And also suppose that p1 x1 and p2 x2, these are the probability densities corresponding to random variables x1 and x2. Then the probability density for individual random processes, that means p1 x1 p2 x2, actually one can obtain these from the joint probability by integrating over the other random variable. What we mean is the following. This of course I think everybody is kind of familiar, but I'm just kind of bringing it again in the beginning of the course, because we will use these seemingly simple concepts. The same concept will actually extend when we study the higher order correlation function, and then it will be joint probability of 4 different events, and that's how we go towards the multi-particle correlation. But the basic concept actually remains the same. That's why we are kind of summarizing this in detail, and actually the mathematical structure will also remain very analogous. So if the joint probability is given, how do you find out the individual probability? Well, it is very simple. So p1 x1, this we can find out if we have the joint probability, and the joint probability here is p x1 x2. So how do we find the this p1 x1? Well, just integrate this probability over the other variable tx2. This will give us the probability for x1. Similarly, if we just do p2 x2, all we need, integrate this joint probability density x1 x2 over dx1, and that's it. So now if x1 x2 are completely uncorrelated, for example, there can be physical situation where these two are completely uncorrelated random events, and in that case the probability density is p1 x1 x2 actually factorizes as px1 px2. So this is a simple fact. Now if here what we have discussed is just the continuous random variable x1 x2, but if there is a for discrete variables, the concept remains pretty much the same. So suppose xi and yj are the two discrete random variables with probabilities pxi and pyj, and if pxi yj is the joint probability, then pxi, that the probability that the xi happens, that is basically pxi yj, that is the joint probability of xi with all the yj, and then we sum it over j. So this gives us pxi. Similarly, the probability of event yj happening is the sum of the joint probabilities of yj with all the xi's, and that's so it's basically same concept. Here is the integral, here is the summation, and these concepts we are actually going to use in an analogous manner when we actually go to the two particle quantum interference effects. Okay, so right, so yeah, these concepts will study for the two photon entangled fields. The one more, the extension of this joint probability, with the joint probability we actually define what's called correlation function. So for more than one random variable, uh, one generalizes this concept of moments to what's called the correlation function. Um, for in fact the very simplest correlation function that one can construct out of two random variables is the following. We have seen if these are the individual random events, then of course we can have the moments of x1, rth moment, or the central moment. But again, if there are two random variables, then the simplest object we can define is the expectation value of x1 times x2. That's the simplest that we can define. So that's the expectation value. And how do we define it? Well, the definition is again analogous, just x1, x2, joint probability p x1, x2, dx1, dx2. So this is the simplest object, simplest expectation value one can define when there are two random variables. Of course, if x1 is equal to x2, but if they are the same event, then of course x1, x2 becomes the second moment of random variable x2. So x1, x2 indeed contains more information than just x1 or x2. So this is a different object than just multiplying x1 and x2. So that's the main point. Now, of course, this is just the simplest, and of course we can have a whole hierarchy of correlation function that one can define with these two random variables. Here I'm putting a very generic one. This is x1 to the m, x2 to the n, and that's the expectation value or the correlation function. And this is the correlation function with mth moment of x1 and nth moment of x2. Of course, then we started with the simple expectation value of x1, and I said that simple concept we can generalize to the product of x1 and x2, and that's how it is defined. But of course, now these individual random variables x1 and x2, they might also they can actually depend on time, and in fact, if we add those time arguments, then these definitions can be even more general, and in that case we can have x1 t1, x2 t2, and the expectation value of that. This is actually called the two-time correlation function of random variables x1 t and x2 t. Okay, so far we have discussed the random variables that are mostly real, and of course in classical mechanics we mostly deal with real variables, but even within classical mechanics we use complex variables. That's pretty much for the mathematical ease, but we do use complex variables. But when it comes to quantum mechanics, we have to use complex variables only because wave functions are complex, and real numbers, the real functions cannot capture everything quantum. So one has to have that. So of course a general random variable in general is complex. Within the classical theory it is optional, but we do use it for the ease of calculation. In quantum theory one has to have complex variables. So but the idea of correlation function remains the same. So let's say now if the z1 and z2 are two complex random variables, then the two-time correlation function that we define it in this manner: z1 star t1, z2 star t2. So this definition remains precisely the same, except that this case we are adding a z star. Now one can also ask when it's a complex variable, and why are we choosing just z1 star and z2? Why not the other combination, for example z1 z2 or z1 star z2 star? This we will discuss little more detail, but these other quantities, I'm just making comment here, these other quantities do not yield meaningful quantity, and in fact this is this is the meaningful quantity in physical situation, and that's why we take it. Again, as in the other case, a whole hierarchy of such correlation function can be defined for complex random variables as well, as we had done it for real random variables. So for example, we have this z1 star t1, z2 star t2, up to zn star tn. These are the complex quantity, and then zn1 tn1, zn plus 2 tn plus 2 up to z2n t2n. So at least in this course, I mean, we will only consider correlation function with equal number of complex and complex conjugate quantities. But the definition actually, all I'm trying to point out, the definition remains same. This we started with the simple moment x1, then we go to x1 x2, then we come to x1 t1 x2 t2, then we come to the complex random variable, in which case the only difference is that we have to put in a star here and not the other combination. And then of course we can have a whole hierarchy of such correlation function. The two-time correlation function, this one, the two-time correlation function is called the mutual correlation function, and when z1 is z1 and z2 are equal, the correlation function is referred to as the autocorrelation function. So this is where we will stop today. So